Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Knight, and welcome to these coaching conversations today. I'm talking with Natasha Sistrunk Robinson, and I'm super excited about our conversation. I want to tell you a bit about Natasha before we dive in, and then I said, go for it. Teach me everything you can in this short little conversation to Natasha. Natasha grew up in a small town of Orangeburg, South Carolina. She was an academic and athletic standout in Orangeburg. She set track records for her high school and winning the state. Set the state record. She went on to study at the Naval Academy, ultimately graduating and being selected as a U.S. Marine Corps officer. She also sang in the U.S. Naval Academy Gospel Choir. She served 6 years in the Marine Corps as an officer, and then she returned to the Naval Academy, eventually becoming the Senior Diversity Admissions Counselor. And she was part of the team at the Naval Academy that recruited the most racial, ethnic, and gender diverse class in the Naval Academy history. And following that, she served in the Department of Homeland Security under the previous administration. Natasha is the founder and director of Leadership Links, a nonprofit organization dedicated to growing a multi-generational and diverse network of like-minded leaders who are committed to using their skills and resources for the greater good of humanity. And their commitment is to raise up the next generation of leaders, intentionally starting with young women of color. As the president of her own business, T3 Leadership Solutions, Inc., Natasha creates leadership development programs that are tailored to individuals and organizations, including coaching, mentoring, and consulting. She's written 2 books that I want to talk about today, Mentor for Life, and her latest book, I'll mostly focus on Sojourner's Truth, Ask Sojourner's Truth, Choosing Freedom and Courage in a Divided World. She spends a lot of her time coaching leaders, including administrators and school districts, and she's particularly interested in what she refers to as culturally conscious coaching. I first heard of Natasha when Jenny, my wife and partner, saw her present at the Apprenticeship Gathering Conference, where she keynoted, and she completely blew people away. In the 9-year history of that conference, I believe she was the first person to get a standing ovation, and Jenny said it was an incredibly powerful presentation. Natasha is an incredibly fascinating person. She's an officer in the Marine Corps. She's a U.S. patriot. She's a courageous fighter for human rights who wrote the following in her book, Sojourner's Truth. We all need to wake up. Knowing our history and facing tragedy makes us more conscious people. Becoming conscious and demanding justice must not be the revolutionary acts of a select few in a society. Deep and lasting change will happen when we see the sacrificial and strategic actions of a unified body of justice seekers working together to demand it. When I heard about her talk, and I discovered her books, I knew I wanted to learn from Natasha, and I'm happy to report that she's now my coach, my mentor, and I hope she's becoming a really good friend to our family and to me. So welcome, Natasha. It's great to have you in this conversation. I'm really excited to hear what we're going to talk about.
Thank you so much for having me, Jim. I'm so glad to talk to you today.
Well, it's kind of funny talking this way. We've had our coaching conversations and other conversations, but this is like, I'm sweating more in this conversation, so it's a little different.
But I got dressed for this one, so.
Yeah, I know. Like I said, I got shoes on, so I'm really stepping up. But you went all out. You got iffy. So in her foreword to your book, Patricia Raybon quotes Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote, "There's no agony like bearing an untold story inside you." So can you tell us why you decided you wanted to tell your story in A Sojourner's Truth?
I don't know if I decided so much as that it was just required of me. I think the agony that she quotes, and Mrs. Raybon is a mentor of mine too, and she's a fabulous writer. And she caused me, I think, to write more courageously about racial issues. And it's not that I didn't know about it. I did. I grew up with it. I understood it. But this book, the words, the stories, started to keep me up at night. And so I just had to get it out and had to write it. And that's what I think Zora Neale Hurston is talking about as well.
Well, it was helpful for me to read the book because I could see the world through your eyes. And it taught me a lot, just not experiencing it at all the way you would have experienced it, but at least to see the world through your eyes. So I thought maybe we could talk about a few elements of your story.
Sure.
So other people can hear it and sort of see what it's all about. So you write early in your book, I'm a Black girl from Orangeburg, South Carolina. This is the core of who I am. Can you tell me more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I'm right now reading Michelle Obama's Becoming. I watched her documentary for the first time a few weeks ago with my daughter. And one thing she says in the documentary is that I'm a Black girl from the South Side of Chicago. And that tells you everything you need to know about me. And I feel very much the same way. I actually published my book a few months before hers, but I pretty much feel the exact same way. Growing up in a small town in Orangeburg that has a rich history of not just of segregation, but also in the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up as a child knowing those stories. There was a massacre, the Orangeburg massacre happened in my town in 1968, when people were college students, high school students were just trying to go bowl at the bowling alley, which was segregated, and that resulted in the death of 3 Black boys. I want to call them boys because they were teenagers. And one woman was beaten, Black woman, college student, was beaten by a police officer, and she miscarried her child. She was pregnant. And so I knew that. I knew those stories growing up. And so I think the uniqueness of the town and the history of the town, the fact that there were 2 historically Black colleges and universities there, South Carolina State University, which is a public institution, and Claflin College or Claflin University, which is a private institution. So that HBCU culture very much shaped me. The Black excellence of that shaped me. The education of that shaped me. And I would say the community shapes people and community shapes leaders. And so I think all of that gave me the grit and the foundation that I needed to go out into the world.
You said the pictures of what you called the Orangeburg Three, those 3 young men, they're now in the bowling alley where they couldn't get into. They've got the pictures as you drive by, and that was something you'd see. And you said your father was really influenced by Dr. Martin Luther King as well, that a lot of his material was around the house, and you were just surrounded by people who deeply were committed to human rights.
Yeah, and you know, in my family too. I remember going to one of my aunt's funeral and had a congressperson speak after her eulogy. And you know, she was one of the first Black people to stand in line to get her voting rights. And so all this history, rich history, was around me all the time, and I didn't know, because you don't always value it as a child. You know it's important, but you don't know how it's going to shape you. But all those things subconsciously, you know, it kind of makes deposits into your life and your heart. And so I think what happened is we started to see these things resurface a little bit more publicly, I think, with the use of social media and this nonstop news. And so those things started to happen more prevalently. Maybe not, it wasn't more prevalent, but we were seeing it more, right? We were getting video cam and stuff like that. And so I think
Right.
all those things kind of took me back to my foundation, and I was able to look and see, well, what did my ancestors do? And to know that I still had the same stuff in me to carry on the work that they started.
Then you went to the Naval Academy. You got a scholarship to go to the Naval Academy, predominantly male, predominantly white. I think you would have been pretty unique in terms of the population when you were there. What was that experience like?
It was difficult to say in the least. And I'm a person, I don't mind doing hard things, but I think the reality was I, you know, was a girl, a Black girl from the South, from a very small town where I was a big fish in a little pond, right? So
Right.
I was smart and I was athletic and I was leading everything. And then you get to the Naval Academy, and not only is everyone doing that, which I didn't mind, but the perception was that you didn't do the same thing that everybody else did to get there. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and you didn't have a right to be there.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a very interesting transition, because whereas I came from a community where all the goodness that had been put in me was affirmed, to get into a place and someone said, not only do you not have a right to be here, you only got here because of a quota. You only got here because of affirmative action. And it's because of you that my friend is not able to be here. And so that was a very interesting dynamic and reality that I walked into. Not to say that I wasn't prepared for it, but I didn't expect people to say it to my face.
Mm-hmm. And then you talked about, for example, a young woman who said to you, I hate you and I'm going to do all I can to make sure you can't be here. I'm going to write the letters up so you can't stay.
Yeah, I don't think she said hate, but
Right.
she was very clear that she didn't like me and that I didn't
Don't
belong.
like you. Yeah.
Yeah, she didn't like me. She didn't think I belonged, and she was going to do everything she could to get me kicked out, to write up my paperwork and to get me kicked out. And that was my, within the first few weeks, like the summer, maybe the first 3 weeks of my arrival at the Naval Academy. And of course, she did it in the hallway when no one else was around. And so, I wasn't going to be in a situation where it was my word against hers. And so you just kind of took it, say yes, ma'am, because that's one of our 5 basic responses. And you carry on with, as the military say, you carry on with the plan of the day.
Mm-hmm. So did you ever consider giving up when you were at the Naval Academy, given all you were facing?
No, not at all. And part of the reason was I came there, I had a lot of scholarship money. So you're looking at the late 90s. I had more than $500,000 of scholarship money. I'd been accepted at multiple colleges and universities. But, once you pass on a scholarship, right, that opportunity is gone. They're not waiting for you to come back and get it, right? They give the scholarship or the seat to another student. And so I came, I basically assessed the situation before I got there. I decided to go to the Naval Academy and opposed to some of the other schools because I thought, not only did I come from a patriotic family, which I did, but I also thought that at the end of the day, it will give me the biggest return. And so I went there with the intention of graduating. And that didn't change because of how someone else saw me or what someone else thought of me. I was going to do what I needed to do within the boundaries that were given to me to graduate.
So what kept you from giving up?
Yeah, I think during my time there, I faced a lot of hardship, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my first semester of my sophomore year, my mother passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And I already came from a family that didn't have a lot of economic means. And so my family, I was the oldest of 3. And one of the motivations was I wanted to get off my parents' books. I didn't want them worrying about me. I didn't want them to have to take care of me. And so I made the decision to go because the Naval Academy was going to pay me while I was at school, and they were guaranteeing me a job afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so I knew those things. Those things were important to me. And so when my mother passed away, my sophomore year of college, that was all the more like, okay, I definitely have to be able to, take care of myself now. And so going back home or going back having not finished what I started and going back and not able to be better for myself and for my family and my community was not an option.
Mm-hmm. I love what your high school principal said to you about your mom, how she gave you enough love to last a lifetime. I thought, what a beautiful phrase.
Oh, I love her. I just talked to her a few weeks ago.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
So another part in the book, you talk about getting a letter when you were in the Naval Gospel Choir from this person who said he wanted to find out if you were related because you had the same name, or I don't know if you had the same name, but your name's unique. And I actually think Natasha Sistrunk Robinson is one of the coolest names I've ever heard. But at any rate,
nice.
And he contacted you and you said, well, come, I like what you said. My mama didn't raise no fool. So you didn't just meet him anywhere, but you said, I'm going to perform at this concert. You can come in there. Why don't you tell us that story too?
Yeah, so my maiden name is Sistrunk. There are not a lot of Sistrunks in the United States. Most of the time when people hear that's my maiden name, they'll say, well, do you know Otis? Which I believe is a famous NFL player. I do not know Otis. I don't think I'm related to Otis, but that's the first question. But there are not a lot of Sistrunks. And so this guy was who was a white gentleman, an older white gentleman. He was researching his family tree. He's a Sistrunk. And somehow got connected to me. I don't even know how he got my email address, but he dropped in my email, asked to get together. And that's when I invited him to the concert, because I didn't want to meet a stranger alone, and
Right.
discovered when I saw him that he was a white older gentleman. And I don't know if he knew before he saw me, but he saw me, and that was very evident that I am not that. um, and and I never heard from him again. And again, not surprised by it. I think, it's a kind of typical Thomas Jefferson and Sally, high situation of, you know, um, you have a privilege, I would say, of writing people out of your story. And, people sometimes ask me, that's a unique name, Sistrunk. Where did you get it from? I said, the plantation. Like, I don't know, because we, unfortunately, so many African Americans don't have the history of their families before that.
Right. And you said at the end of the story that some people don't have the luxury and privilege of ignoring racism. In his case, he just realized that he knew you probably because of something horrible that had happened in the past, a rape or who knows what. But what do you mean by some people don't have the luxury or privilege of ignoring racism?
Yeah, so I think I'll go back to Patricia Rayburn, because she's a wonderful mentor to many. And so she wrote the foreword for my book. And at the same month that my book was coming out, there was another friend of ours, a mutual friend, Amy Julia Becker, who's a white woman. We're about the same age. And her book was called White Picket Fences. And Mrs. Rayburn wrote the foreword to her book as well. And so they've often debated, the two of them, about when is it appropriate to talk to your child about race. And so here you have Mrs. Rayburn that grew up in, during the Civil Rights era, wrote her first award-winning book called My First White Friend. And so she grew up in an era where she couldn't go to swimming pools, or she had to think twice about going to certain places or neighborhoods and stuff. And she has children that are adults now and grandchildren, and knowing very clearly that she didn't have the luxury of not educating her children about race, because that can be a matter of life or death for her children. Right. So it's never a question for Black families or people of color to have conversations with their children. I'm a parent as well, about what's safe and how to, carry yourself, and how to, unfortunately, police your body because you don't want to be perceived as a threat. And so these are conversations we have with our children all the time, because we're trying to keep them safe. Whatever limited control we have, we're trying to educate them and keep them safe so they can come home to us and hopefully go on to live, thriving lives, and hopefully die at an old age, right? And they're not getting shot in the street. And unfortunately, that doesn't always work. Right. We just saw that recently again, with the death of the young Black man, and then now the death of Breonna Taylor. So, it's just every, Black people, we understand that. I think Latinx community understands that. Indigenous people understand that, for sure, that we don't have the luxury of not talking about or educating ourselves or our children about race. And I think people who don't have the same threats or are not up against the same systems, they don't have to think about it.
Right. They don't have to think about it. It's kind of not on their screen or not in their consciousness. This leads to a quote from your book, and you say, we must be aware of the history, the artifacts, and stories that shape our lives before we can respond to the call for justice. So 3 things there: history, artifacts, and stories. Can you unpack for me what each of those things mean and help me understand why we need to understand our history, artifacts, and stories? Why is that understanding so important?
Yeah,
I'm going to interrupt you and say I haven't my own answer, and I read about this, but I really want to hear you tell me what you think about it.
Right. I promised you I was going to listen to Miss Zoretta's Hammond's interview before I talked to you here, and I did, and I think she started to lay some great groundwork. And I think people. I think the important thing to say here is that educating yourself about history and artifacts. And what was the last one I said in there?
Stories.
Stories. It's not a one and done. right?
Right.
It's not oh, I read that one book and I got it, or I have that one friend and I got it. It is an ongoing thing. And so particularly when I'm talking to educators and when I'm coaching educators and administrators, I try to hold them to their values, right? Of learning. Right? So we're not just teaching, that we are also ourselves first learners. And so I think it's important to understand we need to learn these things for ourselves, not just for what we're teaching and how we're going to impact the life of a child. And so, like I mentioned to you, I had this rich history, particularly of the civil rights movement in my home and in my life. And so I was learning that for years as a child before I even read the more serious content that I've been able to read as a result of my education, you know, and so in my advocacy work. And so I think like one very good example would be like the Confederate flag
Mm-hmm.
in South Carolina when I was a
And that would be
senior.
an artifact.
That would be an artifact,
Right.
and it's also history too, though,
Right.
right?
That's true. Yeah.
So in South Carolina, we were hanging the Confederate flag at the top of the state house for as long as I can remember. And so my senior year of high school, I wrote an essay about this Confederate flag. And I wasn't even picking sides, but I'm saying people need to understand what this communicates to particularly Black people that are citizens of not just the United States, but the state of South Carolina. And to understand that the state house is supposed to represent all the people. And so you have an artifact on top of a building, that artifact that's divisive, on top of a building that's supposed to represent all people. And that's a conflict that we need to look at and address. And the history is accompanying that, right? And so I wrote that as a high school student. And then, like in the late 90s. And so I watched for a good 20 years where people were boycotting the state because of the Confederate flag. Tourists were leaving the state because of the Confederate flag. The state lost millions of dollars because they refused to take this artifact down. Millions of dollars. I mean, they were just insistent that it was going to stay up. And so here, the first time I see it removed, well, let me back up. The person that we all probably know, Dylan Roof, who went into the Charleston church and massacred the Charleston Nine, right? There were pictures where he was using this Confederate flag as an artifact. Well, you know, he was wearing it or displaying it as an artifact. And so he had some idea of what it communicated. And probably not as a response to that, but certainly as a part of that long history and narrative, the first time I saw that flag removed was when Bree Newsome, a Black woman, climbed the pole, you know, to take that. So it was like on top of the state house, then it was on a pole, a flagpole. And she climbed the pole. You know, she was accompanied by James Ian Taylor, who was a white guy who stood watch. You know, I like this as a military person. You got to have a buddy and you got to stand watch and watch your back, you know, as she climbed that pole. And it was a part of an effort of an entire team of people who were strategically saying, we're going to stand against this injustice. And so, you know, she's coming down the pole. The cops are already surrounding her, you know, for this, what I would consider a non-violent act of protest. She's coming down the pole. The cops are talking to her, and she's calmly as she can say, "I'm prepared to get arrested, sir." And she's reciting psalms, right?
Mm-hmm.
As she's coming down. And so this is the first time I see that flag come down after 20 years, right? From the time that I wrote the essay, it was up on, you know, in the on the grounds for much longer than that. And then it's after that Governor, I'm the worst with names, Governor Haley, you know, and I'm tired, but well, the governor,
okay.
the former governor of South Carolina, you know, that became, I think she went on the Homeland Security after that, but she ended up signing a policy to remove the state flag. But my question is, you know, like, why did it take the murder of 9 people and that probably not just national, but global embarrassment for you to do the right thing. And I've had this conversation with educators in classrooms and have history teachers and administrators say, well, it's a part of our history. And then my question to them is, but the Confederacy lost. Like, at what other place in our country do we celebrate and honor and set aside artifacts for people who lose stuff? Right? So there's something else behind that, I would say, it's racism that we don't like to name or talk about. And I think lastly, I write about this briefly in the book, that we just don't look at our history. And so, here we are in the country. If you go to Washington, D.C., you get a Holocaust museum, I think 1986 or something. And it's a horrible event. And it's also an event that happened in another country. And yet we have a memorial set up for that, and no memorial in our country at all at that point, really, not a national one that, where people say, let's go and look at this history of enslavement of African people, or let's look at this genocide or the death or the wiping out of, tribes of indigenous people, right, which is a part of our country's founding. And so it's not until many years later, just in the last 3 years, where we get, the National African American History Museum and Culture, in DC, and then of course Brian Stevenson and his work at the Equal Justice Institute, not far from me, with the National Museum of Peace and Justice that people call the Lynching Museum. But this is very new actions that we're seeing in our country of stuff that we just never name or talk about. And I submit that if we don't understand the history, if we don't understand the artifacts, and we don't know the stories and the narratives that impact and shape the ways that we interact with each other as humans, then we're never going to be able to correct it.
Yeah, it seems to me it should be curriculum in schools. This should be a part of the history that's taught in school, wouldn't you think?
Absolutely. And this is another conversation I have with educators, like, what's on your reading list? What's on the curriculum? My daughter is 12. She'll be turning 13 next week. She just finished 7th grade last week. And she said, she got her summer reading book. It's only one book this summer. And I think it was like The Lord of the Flies or something. And I said, you still reading? They're still assigning that? They're still assigning that. But, it also speaks to, what people consider is a classic. Right. And, I'm an English major as far as my bachelor's. And so I've always loved reading. Obviously, I'm a writer. And I think it's very important that we think about what we're assigning for curriculum, what we're requiring as reading. And this is a case I make at colleges and seminaries as well. Like, who's on the required reading list, not the recommended reading list? Like, what's the diversity reflective on the required reading list? And that goes the same for documentaries we assign, in history class. And it goes the same for, people that we raise up as leaders and who we bring in as lecturers and guest speakers, and even cultural events that we expose the children to in the community, or field trips.
Even something like the Harlem Renaissance.
Absolutely.
It needs to get probably more play than it does,
Yep.
So I don't want to let this go, but I want to ask another question that I think is related, and then I want to come back to this from sort of another perspective. But in the book you write, and this is kind of a phrase that you say in a number of different ways, that the first person we must learn to lead is ourselves. Tell me what you mean by that, and how does that relate to what you just explained?
Self-leadership is critically important, right? And I think if we were to look at someone else and assess someone else, we would say, don't tell me what you think, show me what you do. So if someone said, I'm going to help you assess your goals and you're going to live a better life, but you don't see that person living a healthy life, then you're going to say, is that someone that I need to take mentoring or coaching or instruction from? And so many of us, certainly as educators, we are in positions of influence. And again, this is where I go back to educators and their values. So if, say, this issue of cultural competency or racial history or American history, even not just told from one lens, if that's something or an area where you're not competent in, but you know it's a gap in your life and you want to get better at it, then that's only going to happen if you set some intention in your life regarding it. And what I found as a competitive athlete turned military person turned Marine, and now just trying to live a healthy life, right? And when I say healthy, I don't mean about size or weight. I'm talking about someone who's mentally, physically, emotionally healthy, right? That there are choices I have to make every day about how I'm going to live and what I'm going to do and how I'm going to prioritize my time. And I want to make sure that the things I'm doing are in alignment with my values.
Mm-hmm. So, how would you coach someone to see that they don't have the luxury or the privilege of ignoring racism? How would you coach someone to see that who maybe is not seeing it right now?
Yeah, I don't know if you coach someone to see that. I think you coach someone into a better understanding of who they are and how they show up in the world in comparison to um, the big picture of what's happening in the world. And I don't mean just presently, I'm talking about in the past too, because here's the thing, every day we're making history.
Right.
So today is history. What we do today becomes history. And so I think it's important because what I find, especially when I'm working with people that don't identify as people of color, is that, we are all, the rub and the tension and the thing to get over is just the individual thought process of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so there's an African proverb that says it takes a village to raise a child. And so, like, it's not my first thought as a person who was raised by a village to go at life alone or to say, whatever is happening around me or to the people around me is only affected by how I live and how I think. And so I think that's the number one thing, to get people to understand that what we're talking about specifically as it regards to cultural competency and how it impacts, it's like a cloud that hovers over people, when they don't, it's hovering over all of us, but it impacts all of us in different ways. And so you don't see that if you're not in relationship with people that are different, if you're not reading people that are different, if you don't know the history, if you haven't watched documentaries, if you haven't done that work. And again, it's not work that you take in a class or read one book and you've done. It has to be ongoing work. It has to be ongoing work, and it has to be work that you don't see as a luxury item. I remember, when I was in the Marine Corps, I was told early in my career, if you want to be, if you want to promote or you want to be considered a great Marine Corps officer, you got to be good at your job and you have to be a great Marine. So I'm a financial management officer by trade, which means I deal with money and lots of money. But I could have been very good in that job. But if I could not pass my physical fitness test, if I didn't know how to show up and give a great presentation, if I didn't know how to lead my junior Marines well, or to respond to my superiors with a level of respect, I would never promote. I would never advance. And I think part of what we do when we think about our lives individually is that we compartmentalize. Well, this is what I do for my job, and this is what I do for my family. This is what I do in my community, and not understanding that all of that is interconnected, right? You cannot be a great teacher if you're teaching diverse kids if you're not culturally competent.
Right. So tell me what you mean by culturally competent. How would you define that?
Right, that you have an awareness and an understanding, not just about people's worldview and how they see the world, but how the world sees them and how they are impacted by, and again, not just what's happening right now in their homes or their families, because we tend to blame people of color about what's going on in their families right now, not looking at everything that's has happened to get to that point, right? And so to say, okay, how does this person see the world, culturally? Do their attitudes, behaviors, values, experience, and then how the world sees or perceives them? This is where we talk about narratives and stories, and why I think like a story like mine, why it's important for people of color to share their own stories and for other people to hear those stories, to understand that not everyone's story is the same, and not to say one person's story is more valued than the other, but you need to understand that we're not a monolithic group, and everyone's experience is different, and you need to see how the perception of that person even bears weight on them and their community.
Mm-hmm. So culturally competent, it really is to some extent what you talked about before, the history, the understanding the artifacts, understanding the history, understanding the stories.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm thinking as I looked at your work and as we've talked, that it's also, the word empathy kind of has this, I don't know, helping kind of feel to it. It's not that, but it's that I have an understanding of what people are experiencing, is what I'm saying. I think part of, would this be an accurate way to put it, that part of cultural competence is to actually understand what people are going through and understand how it's not just this year or last year, it's hundreds of years.
Yeah. And I don't know if empathy quite gets it.
Yeah, I think,
I
right.
think, I think about my daughter, if she does something and she comes and say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, but she keeps doing the same thing over and over again, then I'm less inclined to take the I'm sorry, because I don't care that you're sorry. I want you to change your behavior.
Right.
Right? That's what I want you to do. Because guess what? Your sorry doesn't help me and it doesn't help you. I just want you to be better.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to be more thoughtful. I want you to respond differently. I want you to honor me and value my humanity in a different way. Right? Because that's what I do for you. I'm not out here doing whatever I want to do, because I know as a parent that my behavior is going to impact you in some way. And so I don't think, we just want empathy. I think it's important that people
Right.
understand that the justice, the doing what is right, right, the correcting the wrong. This is what is needed in our culture and society.
So it's seeing and understanding, and it's believing, but it's also acting.
Absolutely.
Right. I think your story about your daughter is resonating with a lot of parents home with their kids now for the last 2 months. So I think it's a
Look, look, we all in this together, friend.
yeah. Luke's tearing the place apart. So how would you coach someone on cultural competency, and when would you mentor them, and when would you coach them? How would you work those two things out, and sort of how are you define the difference between mentoring and coaching?
Uh, I think so. Coaching is really, I think it's certainly a professional relationship. Mentoring can be both. It could be a personal or professional relationship. And you can mentor someone, I think, for personal growth or professional growth. Coaching, most of the time, is for professional development, unless you have a life coach, then that starts to be more personal. But I think there's some assumptions made in coaching, at least the type of coaching that I do. So I don't want to speak to your expertise with it, the instructional leadership coaching, particularly with educators. But the type of coaching that I do, which specifically is with leaders oftentimes that are leading in different environments, is that the assumption is that, yes, I'm an expert on several things, but you are the expert on you, right? And so to help you dig deeply about what it is that you actually, like, where you are, what you actually want, and then are you actually, like, are your actions aligning with the things that you say, who you say you are, and what you say you value. And I think what happens oftentimes is that people will say, this is who I am and this is what I value, but their behavior doesn't align. And so what coaches do, I think, is that they come and partner with people to assess that. Like, what is this current situation? Like, how do you see yourself? How are other people seeing you, depending on the type of input that you get into your coaching process? And then to start looking at that to maybe outline some goals and to help. So I always think coaching is a good place to start because you can assess the situation. But then mentoring is a little bit different, because mentoring goes into the understanding that I'm an expert on something that you want, right? And so that can be a personal relationship. It can be your gleaning from my wisdom or my expertise or my knowledge. I will share more of my personal stories or experience in a mentoring relationship. But I also, and I'll say this too, I think you can get mentored in a lot of different ways. So sometimes I say I get mentored by dead people. Like I go back and read, Dr. Martin Luther King. I go back and read Henry Now, and they're dead people that I feel are still mentoring me in a very real and tangible way. Or certain books that I read, I said that the books are mentoring me in a very very intentional way. But normally, if we're talking about real live humans, like right now, I think the personal relationship is often there. And so what I do even as a coach is to help people identify who are the people in your life that you can have on your team that could be great peer mentors or can help mentor you in that thing that you want, where you want to go or where you want to be. And so I do mentoring in that way as well. But a lot of times I try to get people to identify the mentors that are already around them and have that relationship long term if they desire.
So let's say a prince. Can I give you a scenario here?
Sure.
Let's say a principal comes to you and the principal says, honestly, say it's a middle-class white person,
Mm-hmm.
man,
Mm-hmm.
and the principal says, I haven't thought much about it. I worked hard and I went to school and I succeeded and I've done well and haven't given a lot of thought, but I hear about privilege and implicit bias and I know I need to learn more. How can you help me?
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to that? How would you respond to that person?
Well, I don't know if I would help them, right?
Right.
Because it's not. That's the thing. The burden is not on the person of color
Right.
to help educate the white people, right?
Right.
It's certainly not the white man. That's not the person of color's responsibility. Now, if you want to hire me as a
That's what I'm saying.
consultant, yeah.
You're my hired coach. We're hiring you to help me be a culturally competent leader in the
But the
school
reason
system.
the reason I say that, Jim, is very important because you have all the time random strangers reaching out to people like me
Right.
online asking for help for free
Mm-hmm.
and don't have relationship, right? And so I said that intentionally. That's inappropriate.
Right.
It's inappropriate and it's unjust, right? Because we have to bear the burden of a lot of trauma and education and experience, and that has great value and it needs to be compensated. So that's why
Mm-hmm.
I say that.
Yep. Yep.
So
Yep.
to your scenario, yes, I actually have a situation like that right now. And so what I find is that I end up mentoring, say, the head of school. That I actually have a client like that right now. Where I'm mentoring the head of school. So he will call me. He'll say things to me in safety and confidence that he won't say with his leadership team or his board of directors. And I am coaching other people on the staff.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I will say to him, there may be things that we read together or things that we go through together. We may talk about hiring practices or candidates. We may, like they just hired a new gentleman, and then he wants me to get with that gentleman to kind of acclimate him into the environment because this is a diversity hire.
Right.
Right. And so there are things that I'm able to do, but it often is determined by where that person is when we start the relationship,
Mm-hmm.
as far as where we can go and how quickly we can kind of get into a little bit of the heavier stuff.
Well, that's what I was just thinking as you were talking. It's not a light thing.
No.
Heavy is a good word. Yeah. I think that I'll just say I think that this is worth exploring, this idea of mentoring and coaching leaders in schools and the way we're talking as one way of addressing this issue of racism in systems.
Yeah.
I think it's, but the trouble is, the trouble is that some of the people who wanted the Confederate flag on top of the Capitol building were educators, so that's a tougher group to work with than someone who says, I know I need to learn and I want to learn and I need you to help me.
Yeah, and I think one of my one of my mentors too, she's written a book and she has a section about diversity, and she does consulting work as well. And she said, her question is like, is diversity nice or is it necessary?
Right.
And I find that a lot of people think diversity is a nice idea. It's a
Right.
good idea. It's politically correct, certainly in our culture and climate. But they don't always assess whether or not it's necessary.
Right.
And when it's necessary, you have to ask, well, why do you need this to happen? What's the importance of this happening? What's the implication if it doesn't happen, right? And again, it's very rare that you see success in that in professional workspaces when it's not happening in people's personal lives. And this is the thing about, you could say the privilege of not talking about race. I mean, there's a lot of research about, just generally white people don't, by and large, I think the last, one of the surveys I looked at when I was writing this book was like 70-something% of white people didn't have trusted relationships with people of color, like trusted relationships, which is very interesting because especially when you're talking about a system of education where you have a lot of white women teachers who or in schools, not even Title I schools, but just schools where there's a diverse community of children that they don't understand. And so they're incapable of connecting or getting the best out of that child because they don't know what that child is up against. And instead of writing that child off or sending the child to detention or putting them on some plan, right? Like we don't do that more difficult work of saying, well, how do I need to show up differently in this relationship?
Right.
What do I need to do, in this space to get the better results? Because the question is, did the child fail or did you fail?
Right.
Because they're children. And so I think, it's important that we, again, I think for educators to say, okay, are you committed to lifelong learning? And I think that lifelong learning means that we have to start reading more broadly, being more intentional in our learning, in our professional development, and our leadership. Like, do you have people in your life that are mentors that are people of color? Have you ever been, trained by a person of color? Have you, and that's again, in addition to the reading and the other learning that you would do. And I just think it's important work. I think lastly, I'll say about this, because I think it's critically important. In 2017, I went to Rwanda. And the first time I even heard the name Rwanda was when they had the 1994 genocide. It was not their first genocide, but the Hutu and the Tutsi people group. They were slaughtering each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the whole world knew about it, and the whole world just let it happen because these were brown people. And so I just remember, at first reading the book, Left to Tell, and how horrible that was, and then got into some anti-human trafficking work. And one of the gentlemen that was on the policy team of that, and I wrote about this a little bit in the book, talking about how horrible the experience was with the research of assessing, that situation. And then to go to Rwanda, and to see that these people are living as reconciled people. They don't even talk about their tribal groups anymore. It's like, we are Rwandans. And everywhere you go, they have this saying, never again, never forget. Right? And then they have so many monuments where they're telling the atrocity of that massacre. And so they're getting healing, and they're living as what we would call a reconciled people, or I would say more justly, because they face the truth and they understand how bad it was. Nobody's shying away from it. No one's sweeping it under the rug. No one's lying about it, right? They said, this was horrible. We're going to stare it in the face. We don't want this to ever happen again. And that's why we remember. And that's why we talk about it. And that's why we educate our children about it. So I went to visit schools there, and you have boarding schools where the most elite families their children are going to school with poor children, and they're getting the exact same education, the exact same quality of education, right? And so all of that is happening, and it's a part of their restorative justice process. Mm-hmm. We don't do that. And that's why we have these systemic structures that by and large is built on white supremacy that continues to fester century after century, generation after generation, because we do not tell the truth about our history.
Mm-hmm. That's a magnificent example. That's really That's really, I wish we had time just to explore this concept, but I want to give you a chance to talk about some of the things you do. Could you say a little bit about your leadership links and the work you're doing with young women, particularly women of color?
Yeah, I guess I really wanted to share with this audience about that is because, we don't know how long we're going to be sheltered
Hmm.
at home or in place. And I know, especially with the summer coming up, we're going to offer some online things. But basically, we're building a multi-generational and diverse community of like-minded leaders that are committed to using their skills and values for the greater good of humanity. And so most of these leaders are marketplace leaders, entrepreneurs, and we work in various career fields. And so we partner together in our work. And then we partner not just in our professional work, but also in our philanthropic work. And so that's part of the next raising of the next generation, that we're investing in youth that a lot of people sometimes overlook or write off early. And so right now, like most of these girls are African American, and already knowing the statistics of that, by 7th and 8th grade, these young girls in general, are losing interest in math, not because they can't do it, but because they're losing interest in it, and no one's challenging and encouraging them to stick with it. And so that's something we intentionally do, and getting them math tutoring over the summer and stuff. And so anyway, we're going to offer some book discussions this summer. So one of the discussions we will have is on the book that you're referencing, my book, in July. But then before that, in June, we're going to do a documentary and book discussion about Michelle Obama's book, Becoming.
Hmm.
And so
I
that's
saw
for
that
adults.
online.
Yeah, it's for adults. They can register. I think we're going to share the link to the website. They can just register. It's free, but we're going to do a 4-part series on that with her book, with a diverse, again, learning from diverse people. So all this is free, but we do want people to register. And so we have a wonderful lineup of diverse leaders all across the country that are coming to share with our community. For that discussion. And then I will continue the discussion to go a little bit deeper in my book in July.
Are you going to try to do next year what you were going to do this year with young girls?
Yes. So, again, we're raising up. We say we're raising up the next generation of
Hmm.
of leaders, cultural influencers, thought leaders, and global citizens. That's what we say. And so we were scheduled, and you were partnering with us in our first. We've done what we call leadership experience tours in the past. So they're not field trips; they're actually intentional learning opportunities and leadership opportunities that we offered for middle and high school girls, for them to learn about history, about culture, about social conditions, and looking at some leaders that actually responded to the challenges of their day, and to say, okay, how can that leader's response inform our leadership with the challenges that we're facing today? And so that's ongoing conversations we've had. This was the first time this summer we were going to have our first global experience. So we were taking a 12-day road trip from North Carolina to Canada, charting the Underground Railroad. And so we were scheduled for that, and then COVID hit. So right now we are planning and hoping and praying that we can go on that trip next summer.
Yeah, I know you had a good photographer lined up for that. So.
I know I did.
Right. I was going to have 12 days of Luke all by myself. So that was going to be the experience.
Well,
Let me
hold on for next year, because
yeah.
I'm hoping that we can still go.
Oh, I can see the images. I think it's just a beautiful idea. I love the content. It gets to your whole idea of history, the importance of understanding history.
Yep.
So I want to give you another quote, and then maybe sneak in a couple more questions. We need more men, particularly those in positions of power, educating themselves out of their own ignorance, leading the fight against injustices to women and people of color, and creating leadership opportunities, mentorship, and sponsorship for women and ethnic minorities. So that's your quote. And here's my second part. Many of the people listening to this talk are likely women who, first off, are applauding just what you said. But they might be feeling helpless about the men around them becoming educated in the way you say. So what can they do? And what hope can you give them that there's something they can do?
Yeah, I think anybody who's in a marginalized people group, and sometimes, that is definitely women, right? And so as a woman of color, particularly as a Black woman, Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer, she talks about this intersectionality, right? And so on one hand, you have what we talked about most of our time together, white supremacy. On the other hand, you have patriarchy, right? And both of them are kind of embedded in our American way of being. And so I think for women, especially women that are growing in their leadership and learning how to exercise their voice, presence is very important. Presence is one of my mentoring principles. And what I mean by that is that how you show up is important. Whether or not you show up is important, because sometimes you have to assess, is this someplace I need to be? Maybe you don't need to, maybe you need to be someplace else. Is this the people I need to be with? Maybe you need to be with some other people. But if you are present, then what Cheryl Sandberg, and there are some other things to talk about later regarding that, but I think she has some good points about leaning in. And so sometimes we are not as helpless as we think, and the system is banking on us believing that we're helpless, and therefore we don't move and we don't do things. And so what I would say is to be courageous in spite of whatever fear you have about whatever power you perceive you do or don't have. And so, and I say that because as a woman leader who has been in environments most of my professional career, not only have I been a minority, but I've mostly worked with men. Right. And so, and high testosterone men. Right. And so I know a lot about that. And so I think if we wait until we're not afraid, then we will never move. And so I think it's important for women to exercise their voice, to just practice speaking up, right? Practice raising your hand, practice taking a seat at the table, because every time you do that, you're making it a little bit easier for the young lady, the woman in the office or in the classroom or whatever that's looking at you, but the one that's coming behind you. So we have to respond courageously in spite of our fear, because I think when we do that, we'll find that a lot of men aren't as confident as we think they are. Right. But they keep moving anyway. And so we need to learn how to do the same thing. I think the last two things that are important is that finding a mentor and or a sponsor. Mentors first, sponsors next. But mentors are important. We talked about mentoring a little bit because this person can kind of help you get to where you want to go. They are partnering with you. They have a personal relationship with you. They care enough about you to invest in you so you can become better. And I get mentors all the time about something, a gap I feel I have in my professional life or my personal life. I get mentors all the time. Sponsors are a little different. Sponsors are maybe 2 or 3 levels ahead of you. You may not have a personal relationship with this person, but this person has seen something in you. You've seen something in them. You've established some kind of rapport, and they get invited to things that you normally don't get invited to. They know people. They have different circles, and what you want is for this person to take your name into a room. This is what a sponsor does, right? A sponsor says, let me, oh, you haven't heard of Natasha? I don't believe, how could you have not, you know, um, why don't you pick up that book? Or let me send you that book. Or why don't you invite her to speak? Let me send you this video clip. So that's what a sponsor does. And as women, we need sponsors in our life. And so if you know someone that's, higher up, and this is your career and this is a thing that you want to go after, do not be afraid to go and have that conversation with that person, to have coffee, to introduce yourself. And I think the last thing of that is to get you a good group of girlfriends, right? Like you got to have a good support group. And so when you having that bad day, those people can remind you of who you are and your purpose and what you've been called to do, and that you can do the same for them when they're having a bad day. And so those good girlfriends, those mentors and sponsors, these are the people on your team, showing up and being present. And then the last part of that is just, being courageous, doing it anyway, even when you're afraid.
So that courage in part comes from, correct me if I've got this wrong, but the courage comes from a really deep commitment to doing what's right, no matter what.
Sometimes, but I think the courage also comes from competence. Right. Mm-hmm. I think women innately, I think there's research on this, right? That we doubt ourselves more than men do. And men aren't necessarily better at the thing, right? Men will they will apply for a job that they're not even qualified for, right? Right. But women will look at the job description and look at every bullet and say, oh, well, there's one thing out of these 10 I can't do. And so I'm not going to apply because I'm not qualified. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I say apply anyway, because you may get the interview, and in that interview, you may learn something, and maybe you're not a good fit for that job, but they might end up hiring you for another job.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of times we take ourselves out of the fight, but I think that competence, getting smart about whatever it is that we are doing, and having that assurance that you have the right stuff in you, don't doubt that, to move forward is really what we need more women to do, because it's not that they're not competent, it's that they don't necessarily sometimes believe that they are.
You've got these great phrases. Don't take yourself out of the fight is a great one. That's good. I want to ask you one more question, then we better wrap up real quick. But
Okay.
how do you, just if you would, well, I've got two questions actually, but how do you go about choosing your mentors? Do they just arrive when they're needed, as the saying is, or are you really intentional about it?
Very intentional, very intentional. And so I think, and I think it's important to say too, that some people are just in your life for a season, and some people are in your life for the long haul. And I think we can get in a lot of trouble when we try to confuse the two. We're trying to force someone who's just a seasonal person to be around for a long term, or vice versa. And so what I find is that I will intentionally seek out people that are doing what I want to do or going where I want to go. That's the kind of people I seek out as mentors. And I also do it across the board too, like, peer mentors as well. So like, I'm in a doctorate program right now, and I intentionally said yes to this program because there was another Latina woman that said yes with me. And I wanted someone to go through the program with me. And so that's a peer mentor. And so we message each other, hey girl, did you do that? Did you read that? What did you think about this? And so that's the kind of, because now I have a buddy, I have a partner, I have a peer mentor. So mentoring is a peer mentor, and then sometimes it's an up and down situation. I think if you're looking for a mentor up, then you're looking for someone that is skilled in an area, trying to fill a gap, right, a professional gap, or they're having success in an area that you want.
So this isn't really my last question. I have one more question after this last question, but this almost last question
that was the third to the last question.
Yeah, that's the third. Just, is there something you haven't said that you think it's important people hear?
No. If they have questions for me, they can put it in the comment, and I know that your people are going to give me those, and I'll be glad to dialogue in another platform if that makes sense.
Well, that's my last question. If people want to contact you, what's the easiest way for them to get a hold of you?
Yeah, the easiest way to get a hold of me is to go to the website. I think we might have shared it, t3leadershipsolutions.com. The letter T, the number 3, and then leadershipsolutions.com. And that's where all of my business information is, and people can contact me there.
I can tell you, if you just Google Natasha Sistrunk Robinson, T3, it'll take you to the website, because I did it today. So it's
awesome.
It's an easy thing to do. Thanks so much, Natasha. I can't wait for our next conversation, but I'm just scratching the surface of what I'm going to learn with you, but I'm very grateful for your time and grateful for your message, your story, and look forward to what we're going to do next. I will just mention that next week, our person on this conversation is Sheila Heen, who's written 2 books that are kind of coaching classics, difficult conversations. And thanks for the feedback, which is about how to receive feedback, not so much how to give it, how to be coachable as opposed to be the coach.
Yep.
And I'm thrilled that I get to talk with her, and I just hope it's as great as today, because I really loved our conversation as always. So we'll talk soon. Thanks, Natasha.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.